Welcome back to class. Today we're going to be talking about the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the Corinthian Correspondence. There we find Paul in 2 letters writing to a church in Corinth. This is important because this is the only church that Paul writes to twice that we have of in what's called the undisputed Pauline epistles. I think we've already talked about that in class before. Refer to Bart Ehrman's book or our book for class to make sure you read about what Paul's undisputed letters are versus the Deutero-Pauline and pastoral epistles. This is unprecedented in the New Testament that we have an author writing to a congregation twice, and they are lengthy letters. We do believe that 1 Corinthians was written first and 2 Corinthians second. Although that's almost half a hazard, the way that Paul's letters are listed in the New Testament are from length. So Romans is the longest, 1 Corinthians is the second longest, 3 Corinthians is the third longest, 2 Corinthians is the third longest, and so forth. So the longer they are, the more prominent they are. So that's how they're listed in the New Testament. But what we find in these 2 letters to the church at Corinth is that it is a splintered community. So we'll kind of go through 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians in later seminars. But right now we're just looking at the city of Corinth, kind of what's going on, how that church happened, and some of the wider issues in the Pauline epistles. So let's look at Corinth, the city. These are, in fact, ruins from the city of Corinth, which is in modern Greece. Corinth was a major city in the Greco-Roman world. It was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. It was a major center of trade and communications. It had 2 major ports in that city, and they were walking distance from each other. So commerce and economy being what it was in the Roman period, there were a lot of ships coming in and out of Corinth, a lot of merchants, a lot of trade, and a lot of money. And what came with that kind of transient business community was some pretty nasty things. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but this was this kind of stereotype of sailors getting off a ship and carousing. That's what Corinth was known for in its time. Whether it was justified or not, Athens tended to be a rival city to Corinth in ancient Greece, and Athenians really kind of made fun of Corinth because of this. During the Roman period in 146 before the Common Era, Rome actually destroyed Corinth, but it rebuilt Corinth within a century or so, because it was such a prosperous city. It destroyed it because Corinth resisted Roman rule, and Rome had to take it by force. But by the time Paul was born, Corinth was a major city in the Greco-Roman world again. As I said a little bit earlier, the economy is based on trade and in industry, and that industry included the sex industry for the wealthy and for kind of these merchants. Prostitution in particular is a big issue in the city of Corinth. So it was known as a promiscuous city, something like Las Vegas. In America we call Las Vegas Sin City. Corinth had that kind of reputation in the ancient period, but the sin was specifically related to kind of sexual immorality that took place in that. And an ancient author, an Athenian, kind of coined the term to Corinthianize, or to Corinthianize, which is basically to be a sexual pervert. So that was kind of the ethos of the city. That's what it was known for during Paul's own time. So let's look at Paul in Corinth. We know from 2 Corinthians 1:19 that Paul and his co-ministers arrived in Corinth in order to win converts. So Paul, in his own words, went to the city of Corinth to evangelize, or this idea of win is a term that Paul uses specifically related to bringing people into the Jesus movement. To that end, it looks like he opened up a small business and used that business as a forum to speak with the populace. Acts has him meeting with Paul and Priscilla and Aquila. Paul, in his own writings, doesn't mention that quite as much as Acts does, but he does. Looks like he starts his own business, and that's how he describes his own ministry. He's there to evangelize Gentiles. That is how Paul understood himself in the letter to the Galatians, which was one of his earliest writings. I know you're reading Ehrman's introduction in the New Testament. Ehrman argues that 1 Thessalonians was the first letter written, and then 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians were all kind of written at the same time or contiguous with each other. I think Paul wrote Galatians and 1 Thessalonians early, and they predate this letter to these letters to the Corinthians. But in any case, in Galatians, we know that Paul understands himself as someone called to reach out to Gentiles. And in particular, 1 Corinthians 12, at the end of the latter part of 1 Corinthians 12:2, he tells the audience, you know that you were pagans. In other words, you know that before you came into the Jesus movement, you were not Jewish, nor a believer in Jesus. Now, Acts tells a little bit different story, and we already talked about this a little bit, but look at Acts 18:4-11, because there, the author of Acts, which we call Luke narrates Paul coming into Corinth, but going to Gentiles. That is a pattern in Acts. But Paul never, ever says he does that. So there is a discrepancy between the way Acts narrates Paul's mission and the way Paul himself narrates it. It's likely that the majority of the people who converted and became incorporated into the Jesus movement were poor, but there is evidence in 1 Corinthians that there were some wealthy among them, which is probably some of the major issues that Paul addresses in Corinth. I think the economic situation between people who went to these meetings is a major issue that kind of relates to everything else. But the primary message in 1 Corinthians and also in 2 Corinthians is found almost at the end, where chapter 15 really is the kind of apex of Paul's argument. He saves the main reason he's writing this letter to the very end. And if we want to get an idea of the gospel that Paul preached when he first came to Corinth, I think it's found at the very beginning of that chapter, where he says that he received this tradition and he passed on to them what he received. And that tradition is this: that Christ died for our sins in accordance with Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So right there, you get the kind of, in just a couple of sentences, the whole lot of Paul's gospel. So Paul talked about Christ died, his crucifixion, in accordance with Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised, and that after he was raised, he appeared to people. So that is, we don't know that Paul knew much more than that about Jesus. Paul never narrates anything about Jesus' life. Paul never says that Jesus said this, so he doesn't quote Jesus. He never refers to any kind of miracles that Jesus did. He is basically, his whole gospel is the death, the burial, and the resurrection, and the appearance of Jesus after his resurrection. That is the entirety of Paul's gospel. And you can understand why this is written probably 20, 30 years before Gospels started being written. So that's the gospel that he preached when he went to Corinth. When he initially got there, it was to a Gentile audience. His way to go about building those relationships was through a business of sorts. Now, let's talk about the larger environment, not just of Corinth, but of the entire Greco-Roman world. I don't want you to forget that monotheism was an incredibly rare phenomenon during this time period. The Greeks and the Romans were polytheists. They believed in Greek and Roman gods, and there was a hierarchy of gods. And every city had its major god. Here you see a bust of Serapis, which is common in Corinth. Serapis was a major god in Corinth. Polytheism was the supermajority of the Greco-Roman world. So when Paul comes to Corinth, there's most likely a Jewish population in Corinth. Most cities in the Greco-Roman world had a Jewish population. They would have been the only monotheists there for the most part. So Paul's gospel is certainly a gospel of the one God. He mentions that quite a bit in all of his writings, that there's only one God. But the vast majority of the populace are polytheists, and they understand that in that pantheon, in the hierarchy of gods, that the gods maintain social order. And when you displease the god, that would cause major disturbances in the social order. So the way you please God, what the gods, was to offer sacrifices, whether it's your local gods in your house, or the gods of the city, or the statue of the emperor at the town corner. You would pay honor there and offer some money or food or whatever. And that's how you appeased the gods. And monotheism eventually became a threat to the gods. Greco-Roman folks thought that was a threat to the order that the gods maintained. So when things went bad socially, economically, culturally, they would look for how did we displease the gods? And they would, monotheists, Jews and this early Jesus movement, tended to be a good scapegoat for social ills. So keep that in mind, and this is pervasive throughout the empire. The empire structurally modeled this pantheon with the emperor at the very top of the pyramid. And the emperor was the embodiment of God to the Roman Empire. And up under the emperor, you had the senators and the equestrian order, and the power went down the pyramid. So they embodied this kind of order. So Paul comes to Corinth, and what happens? So the question is, what happens when a founding pastor leaves? And that's exactly what Paul does. His ministry looks like he goes into a city, starts a church, and then leaves. The thing about Corinth is that he may have been there about a year and a half to 2 years, which is much longer than most other places he stayed. So it looks like he really got this church started and had structures in place. But when he left, like so often is the case in any organization, there became a leadership vacuum. And in that leadership vacuum, people were trying to figure out how they were supposed to be ordered, who was in charge, how were they supposed to worship, what did all that look like. And so these were the troubles that happened in the Corinthian church when Paul left. So not long after leaving, Paul left Corinth and went to Ephesus, another major city in the Roman Empire, and it's on the west coast of Turkey. The ruins of Ephesus are pretty remarkable and worth checking out if you ever get a chance to go to Western Turkey. But there Paul's in Ephesus doing his thing, and then he receives 2 different forms of communication from the church in Corinth, indicating that there are major problems. In 1 Corinthians 1:11, he talks about receiving word from Chloe's people. We don't know exactly who this is. Chloe is a female name, so we know this is a woman. Her people most likely means her slaves. So this is a woman of means, maybe a household owner where the church was housed. We don't really know. We're left. We only know that there was Chloe's people. So a very prominent woman who sent word to Paul through her people to deal with certain issues in the community. So Paul gets this embassy, if you will, of people saying, hey, there's some issues at the church. How do we deal with that? Additionally, Paul is hand-delivered a letter from these three men, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Caicus. And they delivered a letter to Paul in hand when he was in Ephesus. And it was an attempt to have Paul respond to some of the leaders in the church who were disagreeing with some of the things that Paul had originally said. And this is in chapter 7, verse 1. You can read about this. So obviously the leadership that is in place disagrees with some of the things that Paul said initially. And this letter is actually a letter to clarify some of those issues. So in two different occasions, from Chloe's people to these three guys delivering a letter, Paul received word that there are some problems in the church there at Corinth. So it's in response to this this letter and a response to Chloe's people that Paul writes the first letter to the Corinthians. And he writes his letter specifically to deal with each one of these issues that he hears about in the written correspondence and the word from Chloe's people. And then Caicus, who is one of the three gentlemen that brought the letter, he stays for Paul to finally handwrite 1 Corinthians, which is a long, extended letter. Paul talks about this in chapter 16, verses 15 through 18. So this is why Paul writes 1 Corinthians and sends it to the church. So that's how the 1 Corinthians was written. That was the beginning of the Corinthian correspondence. The next lecture will deal specifically with 1 Corinthians and later 2 Corinthians. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. Look forward to hearing some of your feedback.